The morning sun cast long shadows across the suburban streets as Officer Richard Chen started his regular patrol. The wealthy neighborhood of Oak Grove had always been his assigned beat, and over the years, he'd developed what he proudly called his police instincts. At least, that's what he told himself. In reality, these so-called instincts were nothing more than deeply rooted prejudices that he'd never bothered to examine. The streets were quiet that Sunday morning, almost too quiet for Chen's liking. The manicured lawns and perfectly trimmed hedges seemed to mock the tension he always carried in his shoulders. He'd been on the force for 15 years, and in his mind, he had the streets figured out, who belonged and who didn't, who was suspicious and who was just going about their business. As he turned the corner near the courthouse, something caught his eye. A sleek, black Mercedes with tinted windows was pulling into the empty parking lot. The courthouse was closed on Sundays, and in Chen's mind, that spelled trouble. He watched as the car smoothly parked in one of the reserved spaces near the building's side entrance. Chen's grip tightened on his steering wheel. In his experience, he thought, criminals were getting bolder these days. Maybe this was a break-in attempt. Maybe someone was trying to tamper with evidence. His mind raced with possibilities, none of them good, all of them colored by years of unchecked assumptions. He pulled his patrol car in behind the Mercedes, lights off, trying to maintain the element of surprise. The car was expensive, very expensive. Brand new S-Class, he guessed, probably worth more than he made in 2 years. In his mind, that only made it more suspicious. How could someone afford a car like that? He conveniently ignored the fact that he was patrolling one of the wealthiest districts in the city. The driver's door opened, and a man stepped out. He was dressed casually, too casually for Chen's liking. Dark jeans, a polo shirt, and running shoes. No suit, no briefcase, nothing that would suggest he had legitimate business at a courthouse on a Sunday morning. The man reached back into his car, seemingly searching for something. Chen didn't wait any longer. He stepped out of his patrol car, hand resting casually near his holster, a habit he'd developed over years of approaching what he deemed suspicious situations. The morning air was crisp, and somewhere in the distance, a bird was singing, completely unaware of the tension about to unfold in this quiet corner of Oak Grove. "Sir," Chen called out, his voice carrying across the empty parking lot. "Step away from the vehicle, and keep your hands where I can see them." The command came automatically, years of what he considered proper procedure kicking in. The man by the Mercedes straightened up slowly, a look of both surprise and something else. Was that resignation crossing his face? Little did Officer Chen know that this ordinary Sunday morning was about to become a turning point not just in his career, but in his entire understanding of law, justice, and his own deeply held beliefs. The man standing before him wasn't a criminal or a trespasser. He was someone who would challenge everything Chen thought he knew about police work and human nature. The stage was set for a confrontation that would ripple through the department and the community, though not in the way anyone might have expected. The next few minutes would test both men's patience, professionalism, and perspectives in ways that would leave lasting impacts on everyone involved. What happened next would shake the foundations of Officer Chen's worldview. As he approached the Mercedes, the man turned around completely, showing empty hands, a gesture that spoke of familiarity with police procedures. He was tall, perhaps in his mid-50s, with graying temples and kind eyes that held a hint of weariness. This wasn't the first time he'd been in this situation, and it showed in his careful movements. "Good morning, officer," the man said calmly, his voice carrying the kind of quiet authority that comes from years of professional experience. "I'm just here to pick up some files from my office." He reached slowly towards his back pocket, telegraphing his movements. "I have my ID right here." But Chen wasn't listening. Not really. His mind was already made up about what was happening here. "Sir, this is a restricted area on a Sunday morning. I'm going to need you to step away from the vehicle and explain your presence here." His tone was sharp, carrying that edge of authority that had become second nature over his years on the force. The man's expression shifted slightly, not to anger or fear, but to something more complex. A mix of understanding and determination crossed his face as he realized what kind of situation he was in. "Officer," he began again, his voice still steady, "I'm a judge in this courthouse. I left some important case files in my chambers yesterday, and I need them for a review tomorrow morning." Chen's skepticism only grew. A judge, in jeans and a polo shirt. His doubt showed clearly on his face as he took another step forward. "Sir, I find that hard to believe. Let's see some identification, and I'll need to verify your story." The words came out dripping with disbelief, each syllable revealing his prejudices more than he realized. The man reached for his wallet again, this time pulling it out slowly. But before he could open it, Chen's radio crackled to life. He'd already called for backup when he first spotted the Mercedes, and now he could hear the distant sirens approaching. The morning peace was shattered as two more patrol cars pulled into the parking lot, their lights flashing against the courthouse's glass windows. The scene was becoming more tense by the second. Other officers were stepping out of their cars, hands on their holsters, responding to what they'd been told was a suspicious person at the courthouse. But as they got closer, something unexpected happened. The youngest officer's face suddenly changed from alert readiness to shocked recognition. "Judge Washington," the young officer called out, his voice filled with surprise and immediate respect. "Is everything okay here?" The change in atmosphere was instant and palpable. The other officers, too, began to recognize the man standing by the Mercedes, not as a suspect, but as one of the most respected judges in the district court. Chen felt the ground shifting beneath his feet, metaphorically speaking. The man he'd been treating with suspicion was not just any judge, but Judge Washington, known throughout the legal community for his fairness, wisdom, and dedication to justice. The judge whose decisions were studied in law schools, whose reputation for integrity was unmatched in the district. The other officers were now looking at Chen with a mix of embarrassment and concern. They knew what this looked like, what it was. But Judge Washington's next words surprised everyone. Instead of anger or accusations, he spoke with the same calm authority he'd shown from the beginning. "Officers," he said, looking at each of them in turn, but focusing mainly on Chen, "since you're all here, why don't we turn this unfortunate situation into something meaningful? Officer Chen, would you join me in my chambers? I think we have an opportunity here, one that shouldn't be wasted." The parking lot fell silent except for the soft clicking of cooling engine parts and the distant sound of morning traffic. This wasn't going to be a typical Sunday morning after all. For anyone involved, the next few minutes would determine whether this incident would become another statistic, another headline, or something entirely different, something that might actually make a difference. The tension in the air was thick enough to cut with a knife. Officer Chen's body camera blinked steadily, recording every moment of what was quickly becoming the most uncomfortable morning of his career. His fellow officers stood awkwardly nearby, unsure whether to stay or leave, their earlier urgency deflated by the revelation of Judge Washington's identity. "I really must insist on seeing your identification first," Chen pushed on, his pride now driving him more than procedure. Even as the words left his mouth, he could feel how wrong they sounded. His body camera caught every syllable, every misplaced accusation in his tone. The other officers winced collectively. Judge Washington's patience, however remarkable until now, began to show its first signs of strain. Not in anger, but in disappointment. He reached once again for his courthouse ID, this time pulling it out completely. The gold judicial badge caught the morning sunlight, almost seeming to mock Officer Chen's previous suspicions. "Officer Chen," the judge began, his voice carrying the weight of decades of similar experiences, "your body camera is recording all of this, isn't it?" He gestured to the blinking light on Chen's chest. "And those security cameras up there." He pointed to the courthouse's surveillance system. "They're recording too. Let's think about what they're seeing. Chen's face flushed as he looked up at the cameras. He hadn't even noticed them in his rush to confront what he'd assumed was a suspicious person. The courthouse's security system was capturing every angle of this encounter, his approach, his body language, his words. Everything that had seemed so justified moments ago now felt glaringly wrong under the unflinching electronic eyes. One of the other officers, sensing the growing tension, stepped forward. "Judge Washington, sir, we apologize for the confusion. We can handle this internally." But the judge raised his hand gently, cutting off the attempt at damage control. "No," Judge Washington said firmly but kindly. "This doesn't need to be handled. This needs to be understood." He turned back to Chen, whose embarrassment was now visible to everyone present. "Officer Chen, what do you think those cameras are showing right now? What story are they telling?" Chen shifted uncomfortably, his hand finally moving away from his holster. The morning had grown warmer, but the sweat on his forehead wasn't from the heat. The reality of his actions, preserved forever on multiple cameras, was beginning to sink in. His instincts didn't look like good policing anymore. They looked like exactly what they were. A group of weekend courthouse staff had gathered at the windows above, drawn by the unusual sight of police cars in the Sunday morning quiet, more witnesses to what was unfolding below. The judge noticed them too, but didn't seem concerned. Instead, he appeared to make a decision. "The cameras are telling a story," Judge Washington continued, his voice taking on a teaching tone rather than an accusatory one. "But it's not a new story. It's one that plays out every day across this country. The question is, what do we do with this moment? Do we let it become another statistic, another headline, or do we turn it into something different?" Chen's fellow officers had started to back away, sensing that this was becoming something more personal, more important than a typical police call. But the judge wasn't finished. He pulled out his phone and gestured at it meaningfully. "I could make one phone call right now," he said, not as a threat, but as a statement of fact. "We both know how this could go. The media would love it. Racist cop confronts black judge. But that headline wouldn't help anyone, would it? It wouldn't create change. It would just deepen the divide." The parking lot fell silent again, but this time the silence was different. It wasn't tense anymore. It was expectant. Something was about to change, and everyone present could feel it. The security cameras kept recording, impartial witnesses to what would happen next, as Judge Washington prepared to turn this confrontation into something none of them expected. The moment of truth arrived with the sound of approaching footsteps. The courthouse security guard, who had been watching everything unfold on his monitors, came hurrying out with a ring of keys jangling at his belt. "Good morning, Your Honor," he called out, completely ignoring the tense scene before him. "Would you like me to unlock your chambers for you?" The look on Officer Chen's face at that moment was something his fellow officers would remember for years to come. It wasn't just shock. It was the physical manifestation of a worldview cracking apart. The security guard's casual greeting to Judge Washington landed like a final confirmation of everything Chen had gotten wrong that morning. "Thank you, Bill," the judge replied warmly to the guard, as if this were any ordinary Sunday morning. "That would be helpful." He turned back to Chen, whose face had drained of color. The other officers were now looking anywhere but at their colleague, their discomfort evident in their shuffling feet and averted eyes. The courthouse's security cameras continued their silent recording as Bill unlocked the heavy front doors. The morning sun caught the golden courthouse seal embedded in the glass, casting a symbolic light over the scene. Inside, the guard's footsteps echoed through the empty marble hallway as he led the way to the judge's chambers. "Officer Chen," Judge Washington said, his voice carrying that same measured tone he used in his courtroom, "would you care to join me inside? I believe we have an opportunity here that shouldn't be wasted." It wasn't really a question, despite how it was phrased. The other officers recognized this and began quietly returning to their patrol cars. Chen stood frozen for a moment, his training warring with his embarrassment. His body camera was still recording, capturing every second of this uncomfortable revelation. Finally, he managed a stiff nod. What else could he do? The situation had completely slipped out of his control, if it had ever really been in his control at all. As they walked through the quiet courthouse halls, their footsteps echoed off the walls. Framed photographs of previous judges lined the corridor, a visual timeline of the justice system's history in their city. Chen couldn't help but notice how that history had gradually become more diverse over the years, leading right up to Judge Washington's own portrait. The security guard unlocked the judge's chambers and stepped aside with a respectful nod. The room they entered was impressive but welcoming. Walls lined with law books, comfortable leather chairs, and large windows overlooking the city. Family photos sat on the desk alongside legal documents and case files. "Please, have a seat," Judge Washington gestured to one of the chairs as he settled behind his desk. The morning light streaming through the windows created an almost theatrical setting, as if the room itself was ready to witness whatever was about to unfold. Chen sat stiffly, his discomfort visible in every movement. His body camera continued its unwavering documentation, though now it was capturing something very different from what he'd initially expected when he'd approached that Mercedes in the parking lot. "You know," the judge began, leaning back in his chair, 20 years ago, I was pulled over 3 times in 1 week, driving to this very courthouse. Different officers, same assumptions." He paused, letting that sink in. "The difference is, back then, I was wearing a suit and carrying a briefcase. Today, I made the mistake of thinking I could dress casually on a Sunday morning." The words hung in the air between them. Chen's throat felt dry. His camera kept blinking, recording what was quickly becoming not just a lesson in humility, but potentially a moment that would change both their lives. The judge's chambers, usually a place where justice was dispensed, was about to become something else entirely, a place where understanding might finally begin to take root. The immediate aftermath of their entry into the judge's chambers was marked by a heavy silence. Officer Chen sat in the leather chair, his posture still rigid, while Judge Washington settled into his familiar spot behind a large oak desk. The morning sun cast long shadows across the room, almost like prison bars, an irony that wasn't lost on either man. "Would you like some water?" the judge asked, his simple gesture of hospitality breaking the tension. Chen nodded, his throat too dry for words. As Judge Washington poured water from a crystal pitcher into 2 glasses, the ordinary action somehow made the extraordinary situation feel more manageable. "You know," the judge began, sliding 1 glass across the desk, "I could have handled this differently. I could have pulled rank immediately. I could have called your supervisor. I could have made this morning very difficult for you." He paused, watching as Chen took a careful sip of water. But what would that have accomplished? Chen's hand trembled slightly as he set down the glass. His body camera was still recording, capturing this unexpected moment of vulnerability. "Sir, he started, but the words wouldn't come. "How do you apologize for something this big? Something this fundamental?" "Before you say anything," Judge Washington interrupted gently, "I want you to look around this room." He gestured to the walls lined with photographs. Each of these pictures tells a story of justice, both its triumphs and its failures. Chen's eyes moved across the walls, taking in photos of landmark cases, community events, and family moments. One photo caught his attention. A younger Judge Washington, standing proudly with his son at a law school graduation. Both men were beaming at the camera, dressed in suits that spoke of the occasion's importance. "That's my son," the judge said, following Chen's gaze. "He's a corporate lawyer now. But do you know what I still tell him every time he leaves the house? Even now." He paused, making sure Chen was really listening. "I tell him to keep his ID easily accessible, to move slowly if he's stopped by police, to keep his hands visible at all times." The weight of those words hung in the air. Chen felt something shift inside him, a crack in the armor of assumptions he'd worn for so long. His body camera kept blinking, recording what was becoming not just a reprimand, but a moment of genuine transformation. "Sir, I was wrong," Chen finally managed, his voice barely above a whisper. "I made assumptions. I let my—" He struggled with the words. "Your biases," Judge Washington offered, not unkindly. "We all have them, Officer Chen. The question is, what do we do with them? Do we let them control us, or do we learn to recognize and challenge them?" A knock at the door interrupted them. Bill, the security guard, poked his head in. "Everything okay in here, Your Honor?" "We're fine, Bill," the judge assured him. "Officer Chen and I are just having an important conversation about perspective." Bill nodded knowingly and closed the door, leaving them to their discussion. Judge Washington leaned forward in his chair. "You know what makes this morning different from all those other times I've been stopped or questioned?" He didn't wait for Chen to answer. "It's that you're still here, listening. You haven't gotten defensive. You haven't tried to justify your actions. That tells me something important about you." Chen looked up, meeting the judge's eyes for the first time since they'd entered the chambers. What he saw there wasn't anger or condemnation, but something far more powerful, understanding and an opportunity for change. "We have a choice right now," Judge Washington continued. "We can let this be just another unfortunate incident, or we can turn it into something meaningful, something that might help prevent the next unnecessary confrontation. Which would you prefer?" The question hung in the air between them. As the morning sun continued to fill the room with light, Chen's answer would determine not just the outcome of this incident, but potentially the direction of his entire career moving forward. Inside the warmth of the judge's chambers, time seemed to slow down. Judge Washington reached into his desk drawer and pulled out a worn leather photo album. "Before we continue," he said, opening the album carefully, "I want to share something with you." Chen leaned forward slightly, curiosity temporarily overwhelming his discomfort. The album's pages contain newspaper clippings, old photographs, and handwritten notes, a personal history of justice and injustice spanning decades. "This first photo," the judge explained, pointing to a faded image, "was taken on my first day as a public defender, fresh out of law school, full of ideals and hope." He smiled at the memory. "That same day, I was stopped by police while walking into the courthouse. They didn't believe I was really a lawyer." Chen shifted in his chair, the parallel to this morning's events not lost on him. His body camera continued recording, capturing what was becoming less of a reprimand and more of a heart-to-heart conversation between two people on opposite sides of a deep divide. "And this one," Judge Washington continued, turning the page, "is from my son's first traffic stop. He was 16, driving his mother's car to a debate competition." He paused, his finger resting on the image of a teenager's frightened face. "The officer made him sit on the curb for an hour while they ran the plates repeatedly, convinced the car must be stolen." The weight of these stories pressed down on Chen's shoulders. Each photograph, each clipping told a story of dignity in the face of prejudice, of perseverance against systemic assumptions. His own actions from earlier that morning now seemed even more shameful in light of this history. "But here's what's interesting," the judge said, his voice taking on a thoughtful tone. "In each of these situations, there was always at least one officer who showed kindness, who questioned the assumptions of their colleagues. Those officers, they're the ones who gave me hope that things could change." He turned another page, revealing a photo of himself at his judicial swearing-in ceremony. "When I put on this robe for the first time, I made a promise to myself, not just to uphold the law, but to help bridge the gap between law enforcement and the community, to turn moments of conflict into opportunities for understanding." Chen found his voice at last. "How do you do it?" he asked quietly. "How do you not get angry? How do you find the patience to teach instead of condemn?" Judge Washington closed the album gently. "Who says I don't get angry?" he replied, his honesty surprising Chen. "Of course I feel anger, but I've learned that anger without purpose is just noise. What matters is what we do with those feelings." He stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the city they both served. "Let me tell you about my first year on the bench. I had an officer in my courtroom, not unlike yourself, who had made some questionable stops based on what he called instinct. He turned back to face Chen. Instead of throwing the book at him, I invited him to sit in on some community meetings, to hear stories like the ones I just shared with you. What happened to him? Chen asked, genuinely interested. He's now the community relations director for his precinct. The judge answered with a slight smile. Sometimes, Officer Chen, the biggest impact comes not from punishment, but from understanding, from seeing the world through someone else's eyes. The morning light had shifted, casting different shadows across the room. Chen's body camera kept its steady vigil, recording what had become a masterclass in compassion and wisdom. The tension from earlier had transformed into something else, a shared moment of vulnerability and potential growth. I didn't invite you in here to shame you, Judge Washington said finally. I invited you in because I saw something in your eyes when you realized who I was. Not just embarrassment, but a willingness to learn. That's rare, and it's valuable. For the first time that morning, Officer Chen reached up and deliberately turned off his body camera. This wasn't about documenting anymore. This was about genuine change. The small action spoke volumes, and Judge Washington nodded in acknowledgement of what it meant. You know, Chen began, his voice stronger now. I've always prided myself on being a good cop. 15 years on the force, dozens of commendations. He paused, struggling with his next words. But today, in just 1 hour, you've made me question everything I thought I knew about good policing. The judge leaned back in his chair, a thoughtful expression crossing his face. Tell me about your training, he said. Not the official handbook stuff, but the real learning. What did the senior officers teach you about trusting your instincts? Chen's response came slowly, like he was uncovering memories he'd never fully examined before. They told us to always be alert, to look for things that don't belong, to trust our gut. He stopped, suddenly hearing how these innocent-sounding phrases could mask deeper prejudices. And what makes something not belong? The judge pressed gently. Who gets to decide what looks suspicious and what looks normal? The question hung in the air like a heavy cloud. Chen found himself thinking about all the traffic stops he'd made, all the suspicious person reports he'd filed. How many of them had been based on real evidence, and how many on unconscious bias? I have a proposal for you, Judge Washington said, breaking the contemplative silence. But before I share it, I want you to understand something. This morning could have gone very differently. I could have filed a complaint. I could have called the media. I could have made an example of you. Chen nodded, knowing how close he'd come to becoming another headline, another statistic in the ongoing narrative of police bias. Instead, the judge continued, I see an opportunity. You're clearly capable of growth, of questioning your own assumptions. That's rare, and it's valuable. He pulled out a business card and began writing on the back. What if we turned this incident into something positive? The judge explained his idea. He ran a monthly community dialogue program where officers and residents could talk openly about their experiences and fears. Many officers avoided these sessions, seeing them as hostile territory. But if Chen was willing to share his story, to talk about this morning, and what he learned, it could make a real difference. The hardest part of change, Judge Washington explained, is admitting we need to change in the first place. You've already done that part. Now comes the real work. Chen looked at the card in his hand, feeling the weight of the decision before him. Won't the other officers think I'm betraying them? He asked, voicing his deepest fear. The judge smiled knowingly. Some might. Change is threatening to those who benefit from the status quo, but others will see what you're doing and find the courage to examine their own behaviors. That's how real change happens, one honest conversation at a time. A knock at the door interrupted them. Bill, the security guard, poked his head in again. Sorry to interrupt, Your Honor, but you have that conference call in 15 minutes. The judge nodded and turned back to Chen. Time flies when you're confronting uncomfortable truths, doesn't it? His smile took any sting out of the words. "Take the card. Think about what we discussed. The next community session is in 2 weeks. No pressure, but if you decide to come, you'll have an ally in that room." Chen stood up, feeling somehow both lighter and heavier than when he'd entered the chamber. Lighter because the burden of confronting his biases was being shared. Heavier because he now understood the responsibility that came with that understanding. "Thank you," he said simply, meaning it more than he'd meant anything in a long time. Not just for the opportunity, but for, he gestured vaguely, encompassing everything that had happened that morning. "Sometimes," Judge Washington replied, standing to shake his hand, "our biggest mistakes can lead to our most important growth. The question is whether we're brave enough to learn from them." In the months that followed that fateful Sunday morning, the changes in Officer Chen became impossible to ignore. His first step was attending the community dialogue session, just as Judge Washington had suggested. Walking into that community center, his heart pounding against his ribs, he found himself facing a room full of curious and somewhat suspicious faces. "My name is Officer Chen," he began that evening, his voice shaky but determined. "And 2 weeks ago, I made a mistake that opened my eyes." The room fell silent as he shared the story of that Sunday morning, of his confrontation with Judge Washington, and of the conversation that changed everything. Word spread quickly through the department about Chen's participation in these meetings. Some officers avoided him in the break room, seeing his actions as a betrayal. Others, however, started asking questions. Quiet conversations in patrol cars and locker rooms began to shift from defending the status quo to questioning it. One young officer approached him after roll call. "I've been thinking about what you said at the meeting," she admitted. "Yesterday, I caught myself about to stop someone for what I would have called suspicious behavior. But when I really thought about it, the only suspicious thing was my own assumptions." Chen took on an unofficial mentoring role with newer officers, sharing his experience and the lessons he'd learned. During ride-alongs, he would point out moments where their instincts might actually be biases in disguise. "Look at why you're really feeling suspicious," he'd say. "What evidence do you actually have, beyond your assumptions?" The monthly meetings with Judge Washington continued, but they evolved into something bigger. Other officers began attending, first out of curiosity, then out of genuine interest. Community members who had initially been skeptical began sharing their own stories, creating bridges of understanding where there had once been only fear and mistrust. "You know what the biggest change is," Chen said during one session, addressing a room that now included both officers and community members. "It's not just about how we police. It's about how we see people. Every interaction is a chance to either build trust or break it." The department's leadership took notice. The chief called Chen into his office one afternoon, the judge's business card still visible on Chen's desk calendar as he left for the meeting. "Your arrest numbers are down," the chief noted, studying a report on his desk. "Yes, sir," Chen replied steadily. "But so are our civilian complaints, and our community cooperation has increased by 40%. The chief looked up, a thoughtful expression on his face. "Tell me more about these community dialogues you've been organizing." Soon, what had started as one officer's journey of redemption began transforming into departmental policy. The chief approved a new training program, developed jointly by Chen and Judge Washington, focused on recognizing and addressing unconscious bias in policing. Not everyone embraced the changes. Some veteran officers grumbled about political correctness and soft policing. But the numbers were hard to ignore. As more officers went through the program, civilian complaints dropped, community cooperation increased, and, most importantly, officers reported feeling more confident in their decision-making. One evening, as Chen was leaving the precinct, he spotted a familiar Mercedes in the parking lot. Judge Washington was leaning against the car, that same kind smile on his face that had changed everything months ago. "I heard about the new training program," the judge said. "The courts are seeing a difference. The cases coming through aren't just arrests anymore. They're solid, evidence-based policing." Chen nodded, thinking about how far he'd come from that Sunday morning. "You know, I almost called in sick to that first community meeting," he admitted. "I was so afraid of facing everyone after what happened." The judge's response was simple but profound. Courage isn't about not being afraid. It's about doing the right thing despite your fear. 3 years had passed since that transformative Sunday morning. The courthouse steps were crowded with reporters, community leaders, and police officers. Officer Chen, now wearing lieutenant's bars on his collar, stood beside Judge Washington at the podium. They were about to announce the statewide adoption of their community policing program. "When I first met Lieutenant Chen," Judge Washington began, a warm smile crossing his face, "it wasn't under the best circumstances." A knowing chuckle rippled through the crowd. The story had become almost legendary in police training circles. Chen took his turn at the microphone, his voice steady and confident. "3 years ago, I was that officer who trusted his instincts without questioning where they came from. Today, I train other officers to recognize the difference between real police work and hidden prejudice." The program they'd built together had grown beyond anyone's expectations. What started as simple community dialogue sessions had evolved into a comprehensive training system. Police departments across the state were reporting improved community relations and more effective law enforcement. "Last week," Chen continued, "a rookie officer came to me after her shift. She'd stopped herself from making the same mistake I once made. She told me, 'Sir, I remembered your story, and I asked myself, what am I really seeing here?'" He paused, letting the words sink in. "That's when I knew we were making real change." The statistics backed up their success. Civilian complaints had dropped by 60% in departments that adopted their program. More importantly, community trust in law enforcement had risen significantly. People were more willing to cooperate with police, report crimes, and participate in neighborhood safety initiatives. After the press conference, Chen and Judge Washington walked through the courthouse halls, passing the spot where their unlikely partnership had begun. The judge's chambers looked exactly the same, right down to the photo album in his desk drawer. "Remember what you asked me that first day?" the judge said, settling into his familiar chair. "About how I found the patience to teach instead of condemn." Chen nodded, taking the same seat he'd occupied 3 years ago. "I think about that conversation every time I train new officers." "And what do you tell them?" the judge asked, though he already knew the answer. "I tell them that real change doesn't come from shame or force," Chen replied. "It comes from having the courage to look at yourself honestly and the humility to learn from your mistakes." The program's success had caught national attention. Police academies across the country were requesting their training materials. Chen had even been invited to speak at several national law enforcement conferences. But perhaps the most meaningful impact was visible in the small, everyday moments, like the young boy who waved excitedly at police officers instead of hiding behind his mother, or the elderly woman who now felt comfortable calling the police when she needed help, knowing she'd be treated with respect. "You know what's funny?" Chen mused, looking out the chamber windows at the city they both served. "That Sunday morning, I thought my career was over. Instead, it was just beginning." Judge Washington picked up the old photo album, adding a new clipping to its pages. "Today's press conference announcement. Sometimes," he said thoughtfully, "the best moments of our lives come from our biggest mistakes. It's not about being perfect. It's about being willing to learn and grow." As they left the chambers that afternoon, they passed a group of new police recruits touring the courthouse. The young officers snapped to attention, recognizing both men. Chen and the judge exchanged knowing looks. These fresh faces were the future of law enforcement, and thanks to their program, that future looked brighter than ever. "Ready for another 3 years?" Judge Washington asked as they reached the parking lot. Chen smiled, remembering how different this same parking lot had felt that Sunday morning. "Ready for as long as it takes," he replied. "We've made a good start, but there's still work to be done." And there was. But now they had proof that change was possible, one honest conversation at a time.